I think for a lot of us, we just aim too low with those intentions. We say, I want to travel, or I want to make X amount of money, or want to have this kind of freedom or this kind of opportunity. And those things are usually pretty attainable to some point. And once we get there, what happens next?
Hello, creatives. Welcome back to the Art Creative Podcast. This podcast is all about digging into the minds of creatives, understanding their stories, digging into their creativity, and learning more about what motivates and inspires them to create so that we can take action to create ourselves. We hope to inspire you to become better artists and entrepreneurs by learning from the best in the arts and business. I am your host, Sachin Khona, and I thank you so much for joining us here today. My guest today on this show is Levi Tijerina. I've been following Levi for quite a few years now, and he has been a really inspiring photographer for me personally. I absolutely adore his black and whites and the way he shoots moments and tells stories in particular. And Levi found his passion for photography while living in Europe. And after relocating to Denver, Colorado, he began photographing weddings both at home and abroad. Today, he offers tips on how to promote your location, ways to get out of your comfort zone, and the importance of subtlety in art. Levi is a wealth of knowledge, and we are thrilled to have him on today's show. Motivated by keeping his images timeless and creating a lasting legacy, Levi definitely knows how to take more than just a pretty picture. In this episode, we'll talk about how travel inspired Levi, the difference between photographing in Europe and the US, why you need to take more risks to improve your portfolio, how he's used Instagram as a medium to make a statement, and we discuss his upcoming presentation at The Experience, The Violence of Intention. Enjoy the show. This episode is sponsored by The Experience. The Experience is a 3-day photography conference happening this October 2018 from the 23rd to the 25th in Vancouver, BC. 10 creatives will join us from all over the world, and next week we'll announce 10 more speakers, each presenting for 15 minutes as part of our Big Ideas mini presentations. The Experience is for every type of photographer and creative, from wedding, portrait, commercial, fashion, and the fine art communities. The theme this year is the art and business of photography, and we want to continue to push the bar by inviting speakers such as today's guest, Levi Tijerina. And if you want to raise the bar for yourself, learn from the best of the best, be part of a growing, supportive community, and take part in our Adventure Day, then we really want to see you there. Listeners to this show can save $100 on the ticket price using the code PODCAST, that's podcast, at checkout. And if you're a student, get in touch for our special discounted rate. Head to www.experience.thisisarc.co for more information.
What's up, Levi?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Awesome, brother. Thank you for being here with us. Yeah, things are going great. How's your day going?
Not too bad. I typically spend Wednesdays home with my daughter in the mornings. So we just go out. I took her out for a coffee this morning. We kind of just spend some time together. My wife is working, so it's just a chance for her and I to kind of catch up and spend some time together, which to me is really, really valuable and important.
Beautiful, man. So yeah, basically, I'd love to chat to you more about your family and your daughter, of course, but I'd really love to jump into the meat of things straight away. And I understand that you lived overseas for a while. Can you tell us a bit about this experience for you?
Absolutely. So I actually lived overseas at 3 separate times. I've lived in Germany and I've lived in Lithuania twice. When I kind of go really far back, when I was about 13 or so, my best friend and his family moved from Chicago, where I grew up, to Luxembourg. And that's where my heart first fell in love with Europe. When I was 15, I went out and visited him. And it was a pretty clear idea in my mind that at some point in the future, I was hoping to live in Europe. So when I was in college, I took a semester to spend in Lithuania. And following that, I actually spent the summer in Germany working with a Christian youth organization. I was there for the summer. I learned German. Everything we did was in German. And so it really kind of was sink or swim when it came to functioning there. So I was there for about 3 or 4 months in Germany. And then after university, I was kind of looking for a way to step back out of the country or to kind of figure out what happens next with my life. And so I ended up applying for a job at the same university that I had studied abroad at. I applied for a job in higher education, and they offered me a job as the resident director of one of the dormitories. I was a bit hesitant to go back to Lithuania because it's probably not front and center of Europe and not where I imagine myself living longer term, but it was definitely a foot in the door. And I actually took the job offer before I had met my wife. I ended up moving out there. We did long distance while I was there, but I was in Lithuania for another year at that point, working with the dormitories and working with the students and kind of trying to create a culture that was establishing some form of home for a lot of these students that were coming in from all over the world. We had students from 26 different countries that were living on campus. So we were really trying to create a culture there that was represented home or had some sort of familiarity and community, which can honestly be really difficult when you're living internationally.
Wow. And so are there any takeaways from that experience that now feed into your photography work? And I imagine you picked up a lot of skills managing all of these students. And yeah, what was your experience out there and how does that feed into your work now?
Absolutely. So there was a lot of things I took away from that, but I think one of the biggest things I took away is the ability to take risks and that things aren't so linear. Before I took the job, I actually had a lot of hesitations about going back just because I wasn't getting paid a lot of money. It's Lithuania. It's not necessarily, the heartbeat of Europe. So I had a lot of fears in my mind about what the job could have or could hold for me. But I knew looking back at that I didn't want to have any regrets about taking that position. And I knew that maybe a year or two later, I would look back and really regret not taking that position. So moving to Lithuania for me was a big step of faith to just say, you know what, I'm going to take this opportunity. I'm not going to squander it. I'm going to kind of use this and see what I can learn and grow. And what I love about Lithuania is the fact that because it isn't what people typically expect of Europe, or it's not the most common tourist destination, there's a lot of anthropology inside the culture that you can experience and enjoy. Making friends that were Lithuanian and practicing my Lithuanian language skills was definitely a challenge. But I think that was actually a really meaningful way to build relationships and community. When you're an outsider in a culture, it really forces you to kind of either dig your heels in and go really deep into the culture or forces you to pull away. And for me, that meant kind of digging in my heels and really diving into building friendships, learning the language, really attempting to really integrate myself as best as I could. And also ask questions about myself. Like, what does it mean to be an American living overseas? What does it mean to be one of the few brown people that are living in this really white country? So they really brought a lot of those things to the surface that are now 7 or 8 years later, I'm still wrestling through and kind of working through.
Wow. And so with that experience, you mentioned it, you had to take risks. What kind of risks are you currently taking in your wedding photography business? And before you answer that question as well, with the risks that you're currently taking, could you give us a bit of an insight into how you actually ended up becoming a wedding photographer too?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in photography. I was actually homeschooled my whole life. And so my parents ended up buying me a camera for high school graduation, which happened to coincide with my graduation from my associate's degree programs. I got both of those when I was 18. So they bought me a camera, and that was kind of my intro to taking photos. I ended up taking it to Lithuania with me the first time. I took photos. They were all pretty terrible photos, with a horizontal slant and some of the but they were my attempt to kind of interpret like what I was experiencing and what I was seeing. And although the photos were pretty terrible, I think they were my photos. They were my way of experiencing another culture. And for me, it was this kind of anthropology experience of documenting what I thought was important and then maybe coming to find out that what I thought was important wasn't as important as I had imagined it to be. And also just experiencing life firsthand, like, boom, here's a shot of the market where we buy all of our groceries and produce and whatnot. Those things are ways for me to really remember what my time there was like. So that was my first step into photography. And when I came back to the US for some of my university, I applied some of that. I took photos here and there. I did a random engagement shoot for a friend that I was asked to do because I had a camera. But when I went back to Lithuania, I think I was a little bit more motivated to think about what role photography could have in my future. And I think a lot of that was built on this sense of anthropology that I'd experienced by living overseas. Back when I was living in Germany and kind of going through life in German, I learned a lot about myself and also a lot about how I use language and how I communicate, because there's some phrases in German that just make more sense in German. Like when you say it, it kind of just sticks. And I realized that there's a lot of kind of the culture that we grew up with isn't necessarily as embedded as I thought it was. It's not necessarily universal. So for me, experiencing weddings around the world was a really big chance to kind of see what do people think is important and why do they make these things important. I ended up photographing a wedding when I was in Lithuania the second time with one of the local photographers there. And it was an amazing experience. It was crazy because we probably photographed for 12 to 18 hours. It was a long time. No one that I was really with besides the photographers spoke English. And so I just I didn't know where we were going. We'd hop in the car and we'd drive for like an hour and we'd get out. I had no idea what to expect. Like, was this the ceremony? Was it portraits? Was it getting ready? I had no idea. We'd get out and we'd shoot and we'd hop back in the car and we'd go to the next location. But that was a really big way to kind of see what are weddings like in Lithuania and why are they this way? And I think that it really sparked in me a desire to kind of see that around the world. Like, why do people celebrate marriage everywhere? I know what it means for me, but what does it mean for other people? What does it mean for other people living in different cultures? So I think the anthropology is what really attracted me to that. Now,
wow.
That's just like the theory behind it, I suppose. But when I came back to the US, I didn't have a job and Hillary, my wife, was incredibly encouraging. And I told her I was interested in photography. And she said, you really have nothing to lose. This is probably the time to kind of take that risk and jump all in. So I hopped on Craigslist out in Lithuania and was looking for work and ended up booking weddings all over the country, not because I was trying to travel necessarily, but just because I needed work anywhere. And so I got these weddings in Virginia and California and Colorado and Illinois. And that was my entryway into weddings, just whatever I could find via Craigslist. And it kind of just stuck.
Awesome. And so could you tell us about the weddings that you shot in Lithuania and how are they different to the weddings that you're shooting now?
Well, weddings in Europe are typically a lot different, as I know you're very aware with that, to weddings here in the US. Weddings that I was shooting in Europe have a lot more cultural ties into them, I think. There's a little bit more of this traditionality to it, or traditionalism that kind of is embedded. And whereas weddings here, I think, are a lot more non-traditional. There's a lot more of people's opinions coming into it and kind of breaking from traditions, which I think is actually really cool. But at the same time, I also think photographing weddings that are traditional is also really cool because these things have been around for a long time. People have been getting married this way, whether that's like a Chinese tea ceremony or whether it's having a wedding like in a castle and having this really formal receiving line after the wedding like they typically do in Europe. These things are meaningful for whatever reasons that they are for a long time. And so I think shooting weddings in Europe is more of a lesson in endurance. Like things just keep going and they keep going and they're long and the weddings go 12, 16, 18 hours long, but there's always something happening. And I think that was actually a really great entry into photography because I learned a lot that with weddings out there, it was a whole different ballgame than coming back to the US and starting to shoot here where there was more of like a time frame, like a 6-hour day or an 8-hour day. There, it just seemed to be like, hey, you're here for this story, you capture everything. So I think that really impacted the way I see storytelling and narratives in general.
Awesome. And with the portfolio that you grew in Europe, was that enough for you to, I mean, it sounds obviously like it was, but for anyone who is maybe starting out or is relocating, do you have any advice to them for how you kind of switch locations?
I think it really just comes down to shooting a lot of stuff and shooting as much as you can and actually going to those locations that you want to be shooting. So if you're relocating to a new state or a new region, stepping into that state and region, doing shoots, creating content, really promoting your location, I think was really big. I think it also takes just kind of getting your hands dirty. You have to really just be in the trenches making work. When you're not, I think it's really easy to expect things to kind of fall into your lap. And I think with the age of Instagram, there's this culture where you kind of think you've done enough. Like I've posted on Instagram today and I've blogged, so that's it. That's what work is. And I think work is so much more than that. It's making connections. It's building personal relationships. It's paying money to travel to a new location and put some boots on the ground and really build friendships and build relationships as well as creating content. So I'd say never feel like you've done enough. If you're trying to move to a new location, it's going to take work and it's going to take you kind of not throwing in the towel or not expecting things to fall into place just because you've made a post on Instagram or changed your location on your website to X, Y, or Z location.
Totally. And so you mentioned taking risks earlier, and obviously that would have been a big risk moving from Lithuania or starting afresh and really going for it in America. What risks are you taking at the moment and what challenges are you facing?
Those are great questions. I'm still wrestling through a bit. As for risks here, what I want to be doing now is focusing more on narratives in a different kind of way. I want to be thinking through, I think one of the questions I'm actually answering right now is like, what is art? And what does it mean for wedding photography to be art? And I think that question itself has a lot of nuances embedded into it. And so I'm trying to be really mindful with that and think, how do I create meaningful, artistic, powerful images? And I think for me, that means putting myself as well as my couples outside of the comfort zone that traditionally exists. And just giving the preface like, hey, this is going to be a little bit weird. These photos may not be what you expected. This wedding I shot this past weekend, I tried something a bit different. And the groom, he commented, he said, this one's probably for your portfolio. And I was thinking, you're exactly right. This one is probably not something that I would typically deliver, but it's something I really want to try new things with. And I think he kind of got that. Like I was experimenting. And so I think for me, it's like letting my couples know, hey, I'm kind of experimenting. And what that initially means is that, hey, I don't really know what I'm doing right now. And I think just being okay communicating that, say, hey, I'm trying new things right now. This may not work out. And I think I always have the fear of instilling like insecurities in my clients. So when I say, hey, this may not work out, what the words behind that are really saying, hey, I'm not really sure what I'm doing. And so I'm hoping that those things don't make my clients feel insecure about my photography or my ability to take photos at their wedding. But at the end of the day, that's what I need to be doing is putting myself in situations where I have to fight against the tropes that I've built, standard poses, standard hand placement, etc. Those are kind of the risks I'm trying to take right now is getting out of my comfort zone and then also trying to present my images in a more artistic, thoughtful way. Yeah, I think I've done Instagram the traditional way for a long time, and I want to think about how I do that differently. How do I share posts for images that may be a little bit more, maybe less popular, or also presented in a way that's a little bit more artful or thoughtful? How do I use this format or this medium as a way to communicate more than just a pretty photo of two people in love? How do I make this a statement about life and art and politics and everything else? So I'm still kind of sorting through some of that stuff, but hopefully the next few weeks I'll have some better ideas about that.
Yeah, fair play. And so while you're sorting through that and you're making those decisions, I guess you're really carving out an even better idea of who you are as an artist and as a photographer and bringing your couples along that journey. But as you're kind of creating that art, how much of what you're putting out there is written as opposed to making a statement in the actual image? Or are you making images to make the statement and to get the message across?
I think it's a two-part answer with that. I think there's the duality is that both those things are things I'm striving for. I feel like art is most powerful when it's more subtle. And so what I'm trying to do is be really mindful about how I include subtleties in my art that speak for themselves, that aren't necessarily in your face about what I'm trying to communicate, but that also don't shy away from things I want to talk about. And those things typically are race and family and work-life balance and, power dynamics and politics. And that's a lot of stuff to put into wedding photography. Like weddings are supposed to be this really happy, beautiful occasion that doesn't really have any conflict with it. And I think that's good. But at the end of the day, what is art? What is the purpose of art? Is it meant to challenge us and to create controversy that incites a conversation? Or is it meant to just be pretty photos or pretty things that we consume and just kind of pass on to the next? And so I'm trying to think through those things as I create, where like, is this image meant to be subtle or is it meant to be in your face? And I think there's a time and a place for both those things. So I'm still sorting through that a bit, but I think at the end of the day, I want to kind of create some form of hierarchy where those things exist in my work. Most things, I guess, will be subtle, but a few things, and maybe those things that are less subtle are the words that I use to accompany those images. But trying to use my platform and my voice for good, for challenging the status quo and for speaking up for those in the margins.
Beautiful. And is there any personal work that's coming alongside this wedding work that you're also working on?
There is. It's slower. It's something I've been kind of developing more over time. There's a couple different side projects I'm starting to dabble in. One is just more portraiture. I feel like I really need to be better at portraits and using light in an interesting way and really capitalizing on minimal situations, harsh light, dark backgrounds, and some form of meaningful eye contact or portrait connection with my subject. That's one thing I'm starting to build out and trying to find models and test subjects for to really shoot that work. The other side of that is kind of documenting more locations. So I'm working on a few personal projects, and some of these are long-term projects that I want to work on for 3, 5, 10 years. But ultimately, documenting the place I grew up in Northern Illinois, documenting the state as a whole and some of my origins there, and kind of visually creating a journal, if not for anyone else than just myself, of my upbringing and how that has influenced me and impacted me. So I've done very little work on that in terms of actual execution, but I've kind of plotted out a lot of what I imagine that to look like. So I think now is trying to carve out time to actually spend time back in Illinois and back in the surrounding region to just photograph and to spend time driving around. So it's going to be hard to find the time for that. So I'm trying to figure out ways to really embed that into my life so that it just happens. It's not something I talk about and then never do.
Sure.
So maybe ask me again in a year how much progress I made. And you can hold me accountable to actually working on that.
100%, for sure. So that's a good way for me to lead into the violence of intention, which is your presentation this October at the Experience in Vancouver. And the title I'd love to dive into a little bit. How did you come up with the title, The Violence of Intention?
Well, ultimately, intentionality is pretty violent and countercultural. And to actually do something intentionally, to have premeditated thought going into that takes time, and it takes a special place in your mind for just yourself to wrestle with the ideas that you're kind of contemplating. And so with that, I think that's countercultural. And I think of countercultural ideas, I think of this like uprising or this kind of like step up to the plate or this fight against the status quo. And so I think that's where the concept of violence, I think, is present, where to actually be intentional is to combat this complacency within inside of us. And so for me, the violence of intention is really about how do we create a countercultural motif in our lives? How do we balance this desire to kind of be complacent and have things fall into our lap with the idea that we need to be out there working and need to be out there creating, and not just creating something, but creating something meaningful to us.
And creating something meaningful, obviously with the weddings that you're shooting and the personal work that you're photographing back home and around the US. How can photographers listening to this think about bringing intention or more intention into their work? Because, some photographers may argue that, everything that they are currently shooting is intentional, but how can we encourage them to think a little bit deeper into the photos that they create?
I think a lot of that comes down to how you see your life going and where you think your next steps are going to be. Intention is something that we set the bar so low for what that actually is. I remember when I was first starting out and I was living in Lithuania and I was thinking about the future of my photography and thinking, I just want to shoot weddings around the world and kind of get a sense of anthropology. And so I remember Iceland being a place that I had visited in the past and really wanted to shoot at. So that was kind of one of my goals. Like, I really want to shoot in Iceland one day. So the first 8 months of running my business, I booked my first wedding in Iceland. And then that kept happening and I kept booking weddings around the world. And then I kind of sat there for a second and thought, is this all there is? Is this my goal, is to just shoot weddings? And then, it's only been a year and I've filled these expectations. What's next? And I think for a lot of us, we just aim too low with those intentions. We say, I want to travel, or I want to make X amount of money, or want to have this kind of freedom or this kind of opportunity. And those things are usually pretty attainable to some point. And once we get there, what happens next? And so for me, intentionality has to be this bigger scope. It has to kind of imagine, what kind of life do I want to pass on to my kids? What kind of future do I want for my family? What does retirement look like for me? What does my work or my work-life balance communicate to my children or to my wife or my partner about what's important to me? And so I think intention has to permeate every single element of our business and every single element of our lives. It can't just be this, I want to shoot a wedding in X location, or I want to shoot only elopements. Like, once I shoot elopements, then I've made it. And because those things are so fleeting. And in reality, a lot of us aren't going to be in photography for the rest of our lives. So thinking, what happens beyond those things? And so when I think about intention, more than just photography, I think it's not just saying I want to take a pretty picture, but I want to take a photo that passes on a legacy that's timeless because of what's inside of it. But to answer those questions, you have to ask things like the unasked questions, which are, what is timeless? What does it mean to be ageless? So you can say that I wanted to make timeless photographs, but you have to first answer the question, what does it mean to be timeless? And so I think those are the questions that I want to encourage photographers to keep asking. Like, don't just say these buzzwords like, I want to shoot elopements, or I want to travel, or I want to make timeless images. Start defining those things in your life. What does it mean to be timeless? Okay, once you have that, how do you create that in your work? But also, how do you live that in your day-to-day life?
Wow, and those are some really big questions for people to obviously think about, and definitely encourage them to do that. I really love the way you speak, and I feel like you have such a good grasp of exactly where you want your photography to go, why you're doing what you do, and obviously still discovering these things as you go along. But it's really impressive that, you set an intention to, for example, shoot in Iceland, and within a year, you're already accomplishing that and then thinking about these bigger ideas. But sometimes the progress for photographers may not be as quick, and they want to shoot elopements, but it's been 2 years and they still haven't had the opportunity to do that. So for photographers that maybe, these things are happening a bit slower for them, do you have any advice around for a photographer who is still looking to, I guess, book their first wedding in Iceland or their first elopement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for whatever goals you're trying to accomplish, I think it really takes hard work. And I don't mean to talk badly about shooting in Iceland or elopements. I love those things. I mean, Iceland is a place that means so much to me personally, and elopements are just so fun to shoot because of the connection you can have with a couple. So those things by any means aren't inherently bad or wrong. I think it's just making sure that you have a broader sense of where you want to be going with your business. But as to actually how to make those things actually happen in your life, I think it just takes a lot of work. I think we've kind of sold this notion that if you just dream big enough, it can happen. And I think what we forget to tell people is that those things took a lot of effort. They took strategic planning via SEO, where they took traveling or flying to a location, paying money, and then finding a local couple or hiring models or hiring whatever that is to make the shoot happen. I think creating the content is the hardest part. And I think to do that really just takes effort. There really is a very little barrier to entry with starting a photography business. You can buy a camera relatively cheaply, or relatively affordably at least, and you can find people to photograph. And so it's not that hard to get going. But to really build a business the way that you want it to be, it takes more intention and more thought. It says, you know what, if I'm going to shoot weddings in Europe or spend half my year there photographing work, I need to spend half my year there photographing work, which means I need to fly there. I need to spend up time. I need to figure out the immigration process if you're going to be there long term. It means spending the money and putting your money where your mouth is. And I think that's something that we don't tell people as much these days, is that this is going to cost you something, because it really did. And I think on the inverse of that, for me, I spent the first couple of years of my business traveling 3 to 4 months out of the year. And while that's kind of living the dream for a lot of people, what it ended up costing me is the inability to put down strong, deep roots in Colorado where I'm living. It took us a long time to really settle here, to call this place home because I was gone so frequently. And so I think there's always this cost of what we're doing. And saying yes to something is always saying no to something else. And so I think for me, saying yes to all this work that was travel work was saying no to having roots in Colorado. And I think the same goes for everything else too. If you're saying no to the hard work, saying no to spending the money to spend time in these places and shoot and photograph and create content, then you can't say yes to the work that comes later on. So I think it's kind of finding a balance and being willing to take risks. I just think that that's the hardest part, is taking the risks. It's very difficult and uncomfortable to have $2,000 in your bank account and spend 1,000 of that to travel to a location that you want to be moving to or want to be shooting more of to just create content. That's a risky thing to do, and that's scary. But that's what kind of running a business, and that's what being an entrepreneur is rooted on, is taking risks. Now, of course, you want to take calculated risks. You don't want to be wasteful. You want to be mindful and smart about your decisions. But running a photography business is just that. It's running a business. And I think that means you have to be mindful about your choices. And I think that for me is why everything comes back to this idea of intention, is you have to have a vision for where you want to be. And I think, yeah, shooting in Iceland or shooting, anywhere is cool, and that stuff is exciting. However, what happens when you accomplish that? What happens next for you? And what do you want your legacy to be about more than just shooting weddings? And maybe that's all you're keen on, and that's totally fine too. But I think just having a vision for what you imagine your business to look like.
For sure. And even having a vision for your day-to-day life, because I think if you have a vision for your day-to-day life and you start your mornings or start your weeks with an intention powerfully there, then that can feed also into your business. And we've definitely been talking a lot about setting intention with business, but do you have a morning routine, or how do you set intention on a day-to-day basis in your personal life?
I think for me, that's always a constant struggle. My wife is incredibly good about this. She has really good boundaries with her work and her life, and she holds me to a high standard. And I think that's really important. And so what I'm trying to do is to spend less time on my phone, to kind of come home from work, put my phone down, be away from that, to spend time with my daughter, and to make meaningful decisions, to spend focused time with her. And she's only 8 months right now, but having eye contact and to just hold her where she can look at me and we can kind of like laugh and play together. But one thing I think that's really big for us is my wife is a big outdoor aficionado, and she loves gardening and flowers. And so she spent a lot of time in our yard and our garden and kind of making it something really beautiful. And so I think for us, that's been spending time to sit in the back porch together, to have time on our patio with a little fire going and a glass of wine, and just to talk and spend time catching up and chatting. And for me, it's working to make time for those things, because it's really easy to not do that, because if the business depends on you and you're not doing the work, then it's not getting done. But at the end of the day, the things that are most important to me are my family. And so trying to say, okay, you know what? I know this work isn't getting done, but there's so much more important things that are happening, and being present in this moment is one of those things. So that's a constant goal for me, and it's something I'm always striving for. And it's something that honestly, I'm not always great at. And my wife, she calls me out on that stuff. And I think that's really important. You ever need someone that can call them out on their stuff, things that they're not great at. So It's been encouraging to have my wife, be on my team about that stuff and to really chat through those things. So we're trying to embed those things more into our life. Coffee dates, time together, time in the back patio. This was a Memorial Day weekend here in the US this past weekend. So we spent a lot of time in the garden. We're building a greenhouse out there, and yard work isn't my forte, but I know my wife loves the final product. And so just trying to do things like that will bring her joy and bring her life, so that we can enjoy those things together. So we can sit in the greenhouse maybe. I think we're actually going to finish it tonight after this phone call. So yeah, so try to do things like that where we can just build our own life outside of work.
For sure. And so any photographers out there who've been in the industry for several years or even longer than that, but may have not thought about getting into other industries and, thinking ahead about their future, do you have any advice around how a photographer could start thinking about their future and set a bit more intention to their goals and dreams looking ahead?
I think it comes down to kind of having a bit of a plan. And I'm by no means a full expert on this. I'm still asking a lot of the same questions myself, and I'm doing my best to make up answers as I go along. But I think just having a fluid idea of what the future could look like. And I think fluid is the key term. I think that as soon as you come in with this concept of I'm going to do X and then I'm going to do Y, it really kind of tightens you and builds boundaries about what's possible. And I think boundaries are a great place for creativity to flourish, but they're a bad place for creativity to be contained. And so I think having an idea about what you would want to do afterwards. And I personally think the next trend of wedding photographers is going to be kind of businesses merging, people collaborating together and joining forces, because I think there's a lot of people who are recognizing that they want to be doing this more inside of a community. And so I think this is going to be and experiment into what that looks like. But I think it's okay to dream big. It's okay to have ideas that are, to the sky and back. For myself, I have so many ideas. One of my big passions in life is coffee. And so I'd love to maybe open a coffee shop one day. I love design and art. And so I'd love to maybe open a boutique hotel at some point in my life. And I know these are big asks that have a lot of presuppositions that go with them and that probably require a lot of capital beforehand. But I think it's okay to dream bigger than you have before, to kind of imagine what's possible. And also recognize that for a lot of us, we're still relatively young and we have so much of our future left to make these things happen. Just because I don't open a boutique hotel by the time I'm 35 doesn't mean I failed. It just means that might not happen until I'm 60 or 65, and then that's okay. And so I think it's giving yourself 100%. Grace and permission to not accomplish everything right now, but also permission as well too, to just think about the future and just let it be big. Not, I think a lot of us just dream too small.
Definitely. And staying fluid at all times is great, and following that kind of inner voice of what excites you and what makes you happy to pick up the camera or, open up a coffee shop, etc. Just following that gut feeling, and then it may take you to somewhere completely different. And that is a really good way to lead into the experience this October. You mentioned a lot about community and photographers working together, and we're really excited to have you do your keynote presentation at the experience. With the experience coming up, what are you most excited this year to experience?
I'm most excited to just get to spend time with other people who are like-minded, who are thinking through these questions, asking hard questions, but also who just love their jobs and love what they do and are excited to make an impact on the world. I think what we do can be really meaningful. And I think this idea of community is really incredible. And what I love about ARC and what you've done with this is that you've made this into a community experience. I heard so many people last year talk about ARC and the amazing times that they had and how encouraged they were by it, but also the friendships that they built. And so I'm really excited to participate in some of that, like just grabbing drinks with some people, chatting around. I don't know if there's many campfires, but chatting just in general about and talking about life and the things that are challenging us and the things that are inspiring us. I know I have friends that are going to be attending, and it's exciting to just think about that this community that we have is kind of international. People are coming from the US, people are coming from across Canada, to just spend time together and to learn and to, I think, just think through some of these hard questions and some of just the joys that we all share in our jobs, that we can kind of create our own schedules and enjoy times like this together.
Beautiful. And while you're here, you're going to also be teaching an intimate masterclass. Could you tell us a bit more about that and what exactly you'll be sharing within that class?
Yeah. So from my masterclass, the title is called Getting Your Hands Dirty. And a lot of that is going to be rooted in how to build your business from the ground up. It definitely takes intention to create something, but I think if we're honest, not everyone always has a huge vision for their life or for their business. And what I want to do is help coach and guide other photographers who are asking these questions about how to build a business, how to grow their work and scale it up, but also to give them practical tools about how to do that. It's one thing to say like, hey, do the hard work and, travel places or, put down roots and build the content. That's one thing. But then next step is saying, okay, what are the things I actually need to do to make that happen? And so this masterclass is going to focus on those things. So it's going to have some to-do ideas or some to-do options. Like it's kind of like a workbook to go along with it. It's going to have content to kind of say, hey, here's homework to do when you get home. Here's how you can grow a local community. Here's how you can find more work or transfer into a new market. The goal is to actually give hands-on, physical, practical tasks and steps, and to do some of those in class while we're there together, but also to kind of empower people to go home and have work to do over the next few weeks and months following ARC. I think inspiration's amazing, and I love being inspired and love being, amped up to go home and keep growing my business. But I think it definitely is just as helpful to have actual physical tasks to keep pursuing, just to keep you on track. Because if you're like me, you're easily distracted and you have this great fire after a workshop, and then you go home and life sits in and it's easy to get burnt out. So hopefully we're going to do those things. We're going to put down some roots. We're going to talk about hard stuff, and we're going to give you some homework about how to keep growing your business once all the inspiration from ARC kind of starts fading out after a few weeks and months.
Beautiful. And so could you set any pre-assignment homework for anyone who is attending? Is there anything that somebody could be doing in the run-up that they could potentially show you or show the rest of us at the experience? Any projects or ideas that you think could challenge someone who's listening out there?
I think the first thing to do would be to start with a yearly plan. So a 1-year plan, a 3-year plan, and a 5-year plan, and maybe even a 10-year plan if you're really aggressive, and just kind of saying, hey, where do I want my business and my life to be in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years? And dream big. So whether that's traveling for work or stepping out of the industry or having a family or buying a home or buying a rental property or starting another business. Make it as big and as audacious as you can and start thinking about what you want your life to look like down the road. I think that's a great place to start. And I think from there, you can start reverse engineering decisions to say, okay, if I want to have a family in 3 years, then I need to be thinking about my life now. Like, how do I plan to take time off when this baby arrives? Or how do I save enough money to put down a down payment on a house? And what does that mean for my businesses and how much I need to be charging, et cetera? So I think starting with a grand scheme, a grand plan would be awesome. So if you want to build a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10-year plan and come chat with me at ARC, I would love to talk with you about that stuff and hear your ideas about what you want to be doing with your life, but also maybe help share my story and share where I've failed in the past so that you can know what to avoid. But yeah, that'd be an awesome place to start.
Beautiful, Levi. Thank you so much for all your time and everything that you've shared with us today. We're very excited to hear your presentation this October and, of course, spend some more time with you and just kick it in Vancouver. So, yeah, once again, thank you again.
Thanks for having me. It's been awesome chatting, and I'm super looking forward to hanging with you all in Vancouver and to hearing everyone else speak and to spending time with everyone.
Thank you, Levi.
Hey guys, how was that? Are you thinking about taking more risks in your work to improve your portfolio? Are you inspired to travel more, or maybe just use your work and the mediums in which you share your work to make statements? To learn more about Levi, he can be found online at Levi Tijerina and www.levitijerina.com. Get in touch with Levi and tell him what you thought, and tell us too. As a wedding photographer, one of my key takeaways was to take more risks with my couples, to be honest and say to them that, hey, this is me playing and getting creative and it may not work, but that's okay. But also to just be able to start making imagery that is more interesting and creative and taking a shot and explaining that to the couple, just having fun really and being playful. So how about you? What is one thing that you would action from today's episode? Join the conversation. Use the hashtag the ARC Creative Podcast and tweet us at ArcThisIs. We'd absolutely love to hear from you. Finally, thank you again so much for your time and staying connected with us here at ARC. You can check us out on iTunes and subscribe for more shows. And you can join us at the live experience this October in Vancouver, BC. Our next show is going to be with Angela Ryshensky, and we have more episodes coming up with the Great North Collective, Brian Morrow, Nikki Boone, Hugh Whitaker, Joan Guedes, and so many more. So if you are a creative in the community and you know someone who may enjoy the show, then we'd love it if you could share a link with them to this podcast. Thank you to everyone who continues to leave us reviews after our show was just released a few weeks ago. Please continue to rate and leave a written review on iTunes and send us feedback too. We'd love to always grow and improve and be better so that we can help serve you better. Any feedback is hugely appreciated. Once again, I'm your host, Sachin Khona, and with maximum love and gratitude on your creative journey, I'll catch you next week for another episode of the ARC Creative Podcast with my guest, Angela Ryshensky.